What happens when a group of reality-breaking wizards suddenly crashes into a world where heroes and demon slayers are already fighting for survival? When Mad Man Frenrir and his impossible companions arrive in the merged universe of My Hero Academia and Demon Slayer, they quickly discover that quirks and breathing styles are nothing compared to true reality-warping magic. But when their arrival attracts the attention of All for One and Muzan Kibutsuji, the world is about to witness a battle unlike anything it has ever seen. The wizards have arrived, and reality itself may not survive their visit. So, if you enjoy these what-if crossover stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next adventure. So sit tight, get comfortable, and let's get into the story. Reality is a fragile tapestry, a thin veil of logic stretched over the howling infinite, and Mad Man Frenrir just threw a brick through it. In the merged world of the 21st century, a world where the sun-drenched spires of hero society hide the blood-soaked shadows of the Demon Slayer core, the laws of physics were already under siege. Biological quirks allowed teenagers to sweat explosions and shift gravity, while the hidden masters of total concentration breathing pushed human lungs to the brink of supernatural evolution. But none of that mattered when the sky over Mustafu didn't just darken, it unzipped. The sound was not an explosion. It was the sound of a billion crystalline bells shattering at once, followed by a silence so profound it felt like the planet itself had held its breath in terror. In the heart of the city's industrial district, a battle was raging that should have been the headline of the century. Izuku Midoriya, the successor of One for All, was locked in a desperate struggle alongside Sanemi Shinazugawa, the Wind Hashira. They were facing a nightmare born of a dark union, a high-end Nomu whose flesh had been infused with the blood of Muzan Kibutsuji. It was a regenerative titan of muscle and bone, eyes twitching with the kanji of the upper moons, its many-limbed form wreathed in a corrupted version of blood demon arts. "Detroit, smash!" Midoriya roared, his veins glowing with the emerald lightning of 45% power, his fist connecting with the creature's chest. Simultaneously, Sanemi's Nichiren blade blurred, a cyclone of green slashes from the wind-breathing, seventh form, tearing through the beast's regenerating neck. It was a masterclass in heroism and discipline, two worlds colliding to stop a monster that threatened to consume the district. And then, the brick hit the glass. A jagged rift of neon violet and abyssal black tore open directly above the combatants. From the void emerged a floating platform of solid obsidian, carved with runes that hurt the eyes to look upon. Standing at the edge of the platform was a man who looked entirely too casual for a trans-dimensional intruder. He wore tattered robes that seemed to be woven from captured starlight and a pointed hat that leaned at a jaunty, gravity-defying angle. This was Frenrir, the madman, and he was currently holding a half-eaten turkey leg. "I told you, Chrono," Frenrir said, his voice echoing not through the air, but directly into the minds of everyone within 3 miles. "I told you the third left at the fourth dimension would lead to somewhere with better atmosphere. Look at this. Colors. Gravity that actually stays on the floor. And look, the locals are putting on a puppet show for us." Behind him stood 3 figures of equal impossibility. The Voidwalker, a silhouette of shifting constellations. The Chronomancer, a man whose every movement left a trail of afterimages. And the Grand Alchemist, who was busy sniffing the polluted air of Mustafu with an expression of profound disgust. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. In the grim darkness of reality's edge, there is only the arcane. Midoriya skidded to a halt, his green lightning flickering. Sanemi gripped his sword, his scarred face contorting. What kind of quirk is this? Midoriya gasped, his mind racing to categorize the intruders. No, it's not a quirk. There's no biological signature. It feels like the air itself is bowing to them. I don't care what they are, Sanemi spat, blood dripping from his brow. They're in the way of the kill. The hybrid Nomu demon didn't care for dialogue. With a screech that sounded like grinding metal, it lunged. Its arm transformed into a forest of serrated bone blades, propelled by the raw power of a high-end quirk and the speed of an upper moon. It was a strike that could level a skyscraper. Frenrir didn't even look up from his turkey leg. He simply waved a greasy finger. "Too loud," the madman muttered. In an instant, the laws of biology were revoked. The Nomu demon's bone blades didn't hit. They didn't even miss. As the creature entered a 5-foot radius of the obsidian platform, its flesh turned into a cascade of singing sunflowers. The terrifying screech of the monster was replaced by a soft, melodic chorus of "Good Morning to the Sun," emanating from the yellow petals that now replaced its head. The massive body of the creature, once a marvel of genetic engineering and demonic blood, slumped to the ground, a harmless, rooted hedge of garden-variety flora. The silence that followed was absolute. Midoriya's jaw dropped. Sanemi's blade lowered an inch, his eyes wide with a rare, genuine fear. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't plus ultra or total concentration. This was a fundamental edit of the world's source code. "Frenrir, you've ruined the specimen," the Grand Alchemist sighed, stepping forward. He wore goggles that cycled through spectrums of light no human eye could perceive. He looked down at the bewildered Midoriya and the trembling Sanemi. "The biosignatures here are fascinatingly primitive. DNA-linked supernatural abilities? How quaint. It's like watching a dog try to do calculus." "Hey, kid with the green sparks!" Frenrir called out, leaning over the edge of the platform. "Where's the nearest place to get a decent drink? And maybe a map? We seem to have landed in a world where people fight over, what was it, heroes and demons? Sounds a bit binary for my taste. But the energy here is delicious. Tastes like strawberries and existential dread." Midoriya found his voice, though it cracked. "Who? What are you? Are you villains? Are you with the League?" Frenrir laughed, a sound like tumbling boulders. "Villains? Oh, heavens no. We're wizards, boy. We don't have enough morality to be villains. We're just tourists with a very high budget for reality warping." Suddenly, the air grew cold. A cold that had nothing to do with the weather. From the shadows of a nearby warehouse, a figure emerged. He was dressed in a pristine suit, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, ancient malice. Behind him, a void manifested, and a man with no face, only a mass of scar tissue, stepped out. Muzan Kibutsuji and All for One had been watching. They had sensed the breach. They had seen their greatest creation turned into a bouquet of flowers with a flick of a wrist. "Fascinating," All for One said, his voice smooth and cold. "A power that doesn't reside in the blood or the genes. I find myself wanting it." Muzan's pupils slid into feline points. "They smell of the sun," the Demon King hissed. "And yet, they are not the sun. They are something older." Frenrir finally finished his turkey leg and tossed the bone into the air. Before it could hit the ground, the bone turned into a small, golden dragon that flew off into the night sky. He wiped his hands on his robes and looked at the two kings of the underworld. "Oh, look, Chrono!" Frenrir grinned, his eyes sparkling with a manic, dangerous light. "The local managers are here to complain about the noise. Shall we show them how we handle management in the high circles?" The Chronomancer stepped forward, his eyes like ticking clocks. "I'll handle the one with the suit. He seems to think time is a straight line. I'd like to show him it's actually a very tangled ball of yarn." The battle for the world hadn't just escalated. It had been deleted and replaced by something far more chaotic. The wizards had arrived, and the merged world would never be the same. The air in the industrial district didn't just feel heavy, it felt curdled. All for One, a man who had lived for over a century by stealing the very essence of others, took a measured step forward. To him, the world was a collection of assets to be acquired or discarded. He looked at the Chronomancer, the man whose body seemed to flicker like a film reel stuck between frames, and saw the ultimate prize. If he could possess a quirk that controlled time with such granularity, his reign would not just be eternal, it would be absolute. "You speak of management as if you are above the laws of this world," All for One said, his voice a calm, baritone rumble that resonated with the authority of a dark god. He raised a hand, his fingers elongating into twisted, metallic cables, a combination of spring-like limbs, kinetic booster, and strength enhancer. "But everything in this world has a price, and I am the one who collects. I do not know what wizardry is, but I know what power looks like, and I will have yours." Muzan Kibutsuji, standing beside the faceless villain, was less inclined toward dialogue. The Demon King's instinct for survival, honed over 1,000 years of cowardice and cruelty, was screaming at him. These newcomers smelled of the primordial sun, yet there was no heat. It was a cold, blinding light that threatened to unmake his very cells. "Kill them!" Muzan hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and burgeoning terror. "Tear them apart, and bring me their hearts. I will see if their blood tastes as divine as it smells." With a flick of his wrist, Muzan unleashed his blood demon art. Dozens of barbed, whip-like spines erupted from his back, moving at speeds that defied the human eye, aiming to shred the wizards and the floating platform into a fine red mist. Simultaneously, All for One unleashed a concentrated blast of pressurized air and heat, an air cannon boosted by 5 different multiplier quirks, enough to vaporize a reinforced bunker. The Chronomancer sighed. He didn't move his hands. He didn't chant. He simply blinked. To Midoriya and Sanemi, it looked as though the world had caught a glitch. The massive air blast and the demonic whips simply stopped. They froze mid-air, inches away from the obsidian platform. The fire of the blast was suspended in a beautiful, terrifying orange plume. The spines were locked in their trajectory, the barbs still vibrating, but making no forward progress. "Linear progression is so tedious," the Chronomancer remarked, stepping off the platform and walking through the air, as if descending an invisible staircase. He walked right past the suspended explosion, idly reaching out to pluck a spark of flame from the air and rolling it between his fingers like a marble. "You think you are fast because you move quickly from point A to point B. But what if point B hasn't happened yet? Or what if point A is still happening tomorrow?" He arrived in front of All for One. The symbol of evil tried to move, but his body was trapped in a temporal stasis field so tight it suppressed the firing of his synapses. The Chronomancer tapped All for One on the forehead. "Let's see. You've stolen a lot of things, haven't you?" the Chronomancer mused. "Let's give them some back. In the wrong order." Suddenly, All for One's body began to heave. It wasn't a physical attack. It was a temporal paradox. Quirks he had stolen decades ago began to manifest and retract in milliseconds. His arm turned into a giant flame, then a cloud of gas, then a sharpened blade, then back into a human limb, all within the span of a heartbeat. He wasn't in control. The stolen powers were fighting each other across a timeline that had been folded like an accordion. The villain who had terrified Japan for generations fell to his knees, his mask cracking as he let out a choked, multitonal scream of 1,000 stolen voices. Meanwhile, Muzan found himself facing the Grand Alchemist. The Demon King, seeing his spines frozen in time, retracted them, only to find that he couldn't. The spines had been translated. "Fascinating cellular structure," the Grand Alchemist said, peering through his cycling goggles. He was holding a small glass vial filled with a shimmering, mercury-like liquid. "Highly regenerative, sun-averse, driven by a singular progenitor strain. You're basically a very aggressive, very sentient cancer, aren't you?" "I am the perfect being," Muzan roared, his face contorting with veins. He tried to lunge, but the Grand Alchemist simply flicked a single drop of the mercury liquid at him. When the drop touched Muzan's skin, it didn't burn. It reorganized. The perfect being watched in horror as his hand began to turn into fine, white porcelain. The transformation spread rapidly, turning his flesh into delicate, non-living ceramic. Muzan tried to amputate his own arm to stop the spread, but as soon as his blood hit the air, the alchemist snapped his fingers, and the spilled blood turned into harmless cherry blossom petals. "Perfect is a strong word," the alchemist noted, scribbling notes on a floating parchment. "You're quite brittle, actually. Chemically speaking, you're just one misplaced isotope away from being a T-set." Frenrir, still on the platform, clapped his hands together, the sound echoing like a thunderclap that broke the temporal stasis. The explosions dissipated into harmless glitter, and the frozen spines crumbled into dust. "All right, enough playing with the locals," Frenrir announced, his eyes glowing with a sudden, sharp intelligence that was far more terrifying than his previous madness. "We need a place to stay, somewhere with a library, some laboratory space, and ideally, a lot of young, impressionable minds we can fill with forbidden knowledge." "Chrono, what's that big H-shaped building on the horizon?" The Chronomancer glanced toward the distant skyline of Mustafu, where the sprawling campus of UA High School sat. "It appears to be a premier educational facility for the heroes of this era, Master Frenrir." "Perfect." Frenrir grinned, a look that made Midoriya's stomach do a slow, cold roll. "We shall go there. We'll rebrand. UA is such a boring name. Let's call it the Frenrir Institute for Arcane Chaos and Better Snacks. It has a ring to it." Sanemi, the Wind Hashira, finally snapped. The sheer disrespect, the casual dismantling of the world's most dangerous threats, and the threat to the future of Japan's heroes was too much. "You're not going anywhere, you freaks." He launched himself forward, his Nichirin blade glowing with the ferocity of the gale. Wind breathing. First form. Dust whirlwind cutter. Frenrir didn't even turn. He just snapped his fingers. Sanemi didn't hit the wizard. Instead, he found himself suddenly sitting on a very comfortable, overstuffed armchair in the middle of a peaceful meadow 3 miles away. He blinked, his sword still raised, looking at a cow that was lazily chewing grass. Midoriya, was it? Frenrir looked down at the boy with the green hair, who was currently the only person still standing and sane. "You look like you have a lot of questions. Why don't you come with us? We're going to go have a chat with this Principal Nezu person. I hear he's a mouse. I've always wanted to apprentice a sentient rodent in the dark arts." Before Midoriya could protest, the obsidian platform surged forward, slicing through the air at impossible speeds. Behind them, All for One lay twitching in a puddle of temporal residue, and Muzan Kibutsuji was frantically trying to scratch the porcelain off his own face, his screams lost in the wind. The wizards weren't just visiting, they were moving in, and as they approached the gates of UA, the very atmosphere of the school began to change. The stone walls began to hum with ancient power, the gargoyles on the gates began to blink, and for the first time in history, the number one hero wasn't going to be enough. The arrival of the obsidian platform at the gates of UA High School was not a subtle affair. It did not land so much as it anchored itself into the reality of the campus, the dark stone biting into the manicured grass of the training grounds. High above, the sky remained a bruised violet, a lingering scar from the wizard's transition into this dimension. Within seconds, the school's automated defense systems, state-of-the-art drones and retractable laser turrets, deployed with a mechanical whine. "Intruder alert! Identify yourselves!" The cold, synthesized voice of the UA security AI echoed across the courtyard. Frenrir, who was busy trying to conjure a napkin out of thin air to wipe turkey grease from his beard, didn't even look up. The Voidwalker, however, did. The silhouette of shifting stars tilted its head, and the drones simply ceased to exist as physical objects. They didn't explode, they drifted apart into fine, glowing sand that smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. From the main building, a small, white-furred figure in a suit stepped out, flanked by the formidable staff of UA. Principal Nezu stood at the center, his beady eyes sharp with an intelligence that usually saw 3 steps ahead of any threat. To his left, Shota Aizawa, Eraserhead, had his capturing scarf raised, his eyes already glowing red as he activated his quirk. To his right, the tall, skeletal form of Toshinori Yagi, All Might, leaned heavily on a railing, his heart sinking at the sheer, oppressive weight of the energy radiating from the newcomers. "Erasure," Aizawa hissed, staring directly at Frenrir. The underground hero felt the familiar tug of his quirk activating, the mental lock he placed on a target's quirk factor. But instead of the usual sensation of a power being suppressed, Aizawa felt as though he had tried to stop a tsunami with a paper fan. A searing headache bloomed behind his eyes, and blood began to trickle from his nose. "Oh, look at that," Frenrir said, finally finding his napkin and dabbing his chin. "The little man in the scarf is trying to stop me. That's adorable. He thinks my existence is a biological quirk. Tell me, Scarf Man, can you erase the concept of gravity? Can you squint really hard and make the color blue stop existing? No? Then stop staring at me before your eyeballs turn into pickled onions." Aizawa collapsed to one knee, gasping for air. His quirk hadn't just failed, it had been laughed at by the very forces of the universe. "Welcome to our humble school," Nezu said, his voice remarkably calm despite the chaos. "I am Principal Nezu. I believe we have much to discuss, though I suspect negotiation is a word you find rather quaint." "Smart mouse." Frenrir hopped off the platform, his boots clacking on the pavement. "I like him. He's got the soul of a philosopher, and the temperament of a chess master. Listen, Mouse King, we've decided to take over. Don't worry, we're not going to kill anyone, unless they're exceptionally boring. We're just rebranding. This hero business is far too narrow-minded. You're training children to punch things. We're going to train them to understand why the things they're punching shouldn't exist in the first place." As Frenrir spoke, he slammed his staff, a gnarled piece of wood topped with a pulsing, translucent crystal, into the ground. A shockwave of arcane energy rippled outward. The sleek, modern architecture of UA began to groan and warp. The H-shaped main building stretched upward, its glass windows transforming into stained glass depictions of celestial wars. Gargoyles sprouted from the eaves, shaking off stone dust, and beginning to sing, in low operatic voices, about the futility of mortal ambition. The training grounds shifted into a labyrinth of shifting geometries, where the sky changed color every 20 paces. The Frenrir Institute of Arcane Chaos is now open for enrollment, the madman declared, a manic grin splitting his face. While the rebranding of UA was underway, hundreds of miles away in the hidden fortress of the Demon Slayer Corps, a different kind of alarm was being raised. In the tranquil gardens of the Ubuyashiki estate, Kagaya Ubuyashiki sat perfectly still, his sightless eyes turned toward the horizon. Despite his blindness, he could see the shift. The sun had appeared in Mustafu, but it was a sun that did not burn with heat. It burned with a cold, terrifying authority. "The balance is gone," Kagaya whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "The demons are hiding in the deepest pits, and the heroes are being unmade. Amane, call the Hashira, all of them, even those on the furthest borders. We must know if these wizards are the salvation of humanity or its final, beautiful end." Around him, the Hashira emerged from the shadows. Gyome Himejima, the stone Hashira, was already weeping, his hands clasped in prayer. "The earth itself is screaming, Oyakata-sama. The very stones beneath Mustafu have forgotten how to be stones." "I will go," Shinobu Kocho, the insect Hashira, said, her usual smile strained and brittle. "If they truly possess the power of the sun, perhaps they have the cure for the poison that is Muzan. Or perhaps they are simply a larger predator." Back at UA, the students of Class 1A were being ushered into the newly transformed Great Hall. Bakugo was snarling, his palms sparking, though the sparks were turning into tiny, harmless butterflies before they could even pop. Todoroki was staring at his hands, his ice and fire manifesting as swirling patterns of liquid silver and golden sand. "What did you do to us?" Bakugo roared, lunging toward the Voidwalker. "Give me back my quirk, you freak!" The Voidwalker didn't move. Bakugo didn't hit him. Instead, the explosive boy passed right through the wizard's shadowy form, emerging on the other side with his costume turned into a pink frilly tutu and his hair styled into elaborate, sparkling pigtails. "Anger is a very low-level vibration," the Voidwalker whispered, his voice sounding like the wind between galaxies. "Try to be more translucent." Frenrir walked to the front of the hall, stepping onto a podium that grew out of the floor like a living tree. He looked out at the assembled students, the future protectors of Japan, and saw only raw material. "Listen up, you wonderful little accidents of biology," Frenrir shouted, throwing his arms wide. "Today you stop being heroes. Today you become apprentices. We're going to teach you the real secrets of the world, like how to turn your shadow into a bodyguard, how to brew a potion that lets you hear the thoughts of the grass, and most importantly, how to not explode when you look directly at the face of a god." He paused, his eyes landing on Izuku Midoriya, who was scribbling frantically in a notebook that was currently trying to eat his pen. "Especially you, Greenbean," Frenrir pointed a long, bony finger. "That power you carry, that one for all, it's a very heavy soul you've inherited. How would you like to learn how to actually use the ghosts living in your head instead of just letting them kick your shins?" Midoriya looked up, terror and curiosity warring in his eyes. Behind him, the doors of the hall creaked open. The Hashira had arrived at the gates, their blades drawn, their breathing steady, ready to face the gods who had stolen the sky. The gates of the newly christened Frenrir Institute did not swing open. They dissolved into a mist of glowing willow-wisps as the Hashira made their entrance. Leading the vanguard was Gyome Himejima, his massive frame trembling with a sorrowful, rhythmic power. Beside him, Shinobu Kocho moved with a grace that masked her lethal intent, her hand resting on the hilt of her sting-like blade. Behind them followed the rest of the Demon Slayer Corps' elite, their hearts hammering in a synchronized cadence of total concentration breathing. They were used to the supernatural, to demons who could manipulate ice, fire, and space. But the atmosphere of the campus was something else entirely. It felt as though the very air was sentient and was currently mocking their existence. "Stop right there, spirits of the void!" Sanemi Shinazugawa roared, having finally made his way back from the meadow where he had been dumped. He was disheveled, grass stains on his uniform, but his Nichirin blade was drawn and ready. "You've toyed with the laws of this land long enough. Explain yourselves, or be purged like the filth you are." Frenrir, still standing on his living tree podium, leaned forward and squinted. "Oh, more of the management team. And look, they brought swords. How adorable. It's like they're living in a very violent fairy tale." He looked over at the Grand Alchemist, who was currently floating 3 feet off the ground, peering at a vial of glowing blue fluid. "Alchemist, look at their lungs. They're doing that thing again." The Grand Alchemist adjusted his goggles, the lenses whirring as they zoomed in on Guillaume's chest. "Fascinating. They're forcing oxygen into their bloodstreams to mimic the physical output of a low-tier magical construct. It's an incredibly inefficient way to achieve superhuman strength. It's like trying to power a starship by blowing into the sails." "Is that so?" Shinobu's voice was like silk over a razor. She had moved with a burst of speed that left an afterimage, her blade aimed directly at the alchemist's throat. "Then perhaps you won't mind if I test this inefficiency against your neck." She didn't hit him. As her blade entered the alchemist's personal space, the metal of the sword began to weep. The Nichirin steel, forged from sunlight-bathed ore, softened and turned into a stream of molten lavender-scented wax. Shinobu gasped, stumbling back as her weapon simply dripped onto the floor, cooling into a harmless purple puddle. Now, the alchemist chided, tapping a finger against her forehead. "Metal is just a state of mind, little butterfly. Why be so rigid?" "Silence!" Guillaume's voice boomed, his spiked flail and axe swinging in a wide, crushing arc. The air groaned under the weight of the stone breathing. "First form, if you are gods, then know that we have faced demons who thought the same. We will not allow the hearts of these children to be corrupted by your chaos." The Voidwalker moved then. He didn't intercept the flail, he simply stood in its path. The massive iron weight passed through his starry chest as if it were a shadow. On the other side, the weapon didn't hit the ground. It emerged transformed into a giant fluffy marshmallow. Guillaume blinked, his blind eyes turning toward the sudden scent of sugar. "Enough!" Frenrir yelled, his voice suddenly losing its playful edge. The temperature in the hall plummeted, and the stained glass windows began to rattle in their frames. "I'm trying to give a lecture. Do you have any idea how hard it is to find a captive audience that hasn't already been driven mad by my presence? You breathers and heroes are so obsessed with your little rules. Don't do this, it's a crime. Do that, it's heroic. It's exhausting." He stepped off the podium, walking through the air toward the gathered Hashira and the trembling students of Class 1A. With a wave of his hand, he conjured a series of floating translucent screens that displayed the entire world. They saw Muzan Kibutsuji hiding in a mountain fortress, frantically trying to scrub the porcelain from his skin. They saw All for One trapped in a temporal loop, his body flicking through 1,000 years of evolution in a second. "Look at them," Frenrir sneered. "The kings of your world. One is a coward who fears the sun, and the other is a glutton who eats souls because he's afraid of being forgotten. And you spend all your time trying to slay or apprehend them. It's like watching ants fight over a breadcrumb while a rainstorm is coming." He turned back to Midoriya, who was staring at the screens with wide, horrified eyes. "You, Greenbean, you have the souls of 8 dead men and women inside you. They're screaming for justice, for peace, for a better tomorrow. But they don't know what tomorrow looks like because they're stuck in the past." Frenrir snapped his fingers. Suddenly, the inner world of One for All, the misty, dark void where the vestiges lived, was ripped open for everyone to see. The ghostly figures of the previous users appeared, flickering like old projections. Nana Shimura, the first user. All of them stood in a line, looking bewildered as they were dragged into the physical realm by the wizard's sheer force of will. What is this?" All Might gasped, seeing his mentor Nana, standing before him as a translucent specter. "It's a family reunion," Frenrir chirped. "I'm going to show you what happens when you stop breathing through your lungs and start breathing through the universe. Chrono, if you please." The Chronomancer stepped forward and tapped the ground. Time didn't stop, but it began to run in parallel. For the Hashira, they suddenly felt their breathing styles evolve. The water of Giyu Tomioka's style wasn't just a visual metaphor anymore. Actual, freezing ocean water began to swirl around his blade, pulled from a distant sea through a crack in space. The flame of Kyojuro Rengoku's legacy, carried by the memory of his spirit, ignited into a white-hot solar flare that didn't burn the wood but purified the air. "This is arcane awakening," Frenrir explained, his eyes glowing like dying stars. "I'm taking your little quirks and styles and stripping away the biological limits. I'm turning your metaphors into reality. You want to be heroes? Fine. But you're going to be heroes who can juggle moons and rewrite history. Because there's something coming. Something that even I find a little bit concerning." A hush fell over the room. Even Bakugo, still in his tutu, stopped snarling. "What could possibly concern someone like you?" Principal Nezu asked, his tail twitching. Frenrir pointed up. Through the ceiling, which had become transparent, they saw the stars. But the stars were moving. They were being snuffed out, one by one, as a massive, oily darkness began to coil around the planet. "The Void Eaters," the Void Walker whispered, his voice a cold shiver. "They followed our trail. They don't want your souls, or your blood, or your society. They want the information of this world. They want to delete you from existence, so they can digest the memory of your history." Frenrir looked at the Hashira and the heroes, his face settling into a grim, sharp mask. "So, are we going to keep arguing about who's a villain and who's a freak? Or are you going to let me teach you how to blow up a galaxy before dinner?" The Hashira looked at each other. Sanemi gripped his marshmallow-ended sword. Shinobu looked at her melted blade. Then, slowly, Gyome Himejima knelt. Not out of worship, but out of a desperate, terrifying realization. "The stone has spoken," Gyome whispered. "We are but children in the dark. Teach us, madman. Teach us how to save the world from the nothingness." Frenrir grinned, and for the first time, it wasn't a manic look. It was the look of a general preparing for a war that would break the heavens. "Class is in session," he said. "First lesson, reality is a lie. Second lesson, only the loud survive." The training grounds of the Frenrir Institute, formerly known as UA's Ground Beta, had ceased to resemble a city. Under the influence of the Grand Alchemist and the Chronomancer, the urban landscape had been folded into a tesseract, a four-dimensional playground where forward sometimes meant yesterday, and up was a color rather than a direction. Here, the students of Class 1A and the Hashira were being subjected to a curriculum that would have driven a sane mind to manual shutdown. Izuku Midoriya stood at the center of a swirling vortex of soul smoke. Beside him, the physical manifestations of the one-for-all vestiges, Nana Shimura, Daigoro Banjo, and the others, were no longer flickering ghosts. They were solid, vibrant entities, tethered to Midoriya by glowing umbilical cords of pure arcane intent. "Don't just swing your arm, Green Bean," Frenrir shouted from his hovering lounge chair, which was currently made of solidified lightning. He was lazily tossing grapes into his mouth, each fruit exploding into a tiny firework upon contact with his teeth. "The punch isn't the point. The punch is just a physical greeting. I want you to hit the concept of the target. If you're fighting a wall, don't break the bricks. Break the idea that the wall is solid." Midoriya exhaled, his breath coming out as glowing emerald mist. I think I understand, Master Frenrir. Nana, now." The specter of Nana Shimura surged forward, her form merging with Midoriya's right side. As he threw a punch at a target dummy made of irrelevant matter, the strike didn't just impact. It rippled through the air, causing the dummy to turn into liquid light, and then evaporate into a series of mathematical equations that drifted away on the wind. "Better," Frenrir cackled. "Still a bit too much effort, though. Magic is about being lazy enough to let the universe do the work for you." In another quadrant of the Tesseract, the Hashira were undergoing a similarly violent evolution. Giyu Tomioka, the Water Hashira, was locked in a duel with the Void Walker, Giyu's Nichiren blade, now permanently encased in a swirling torrent of actual, high-pressure seawater, lashed out with the speed of a tidal wave. But the Void Walker simply stepped through the water as if it were a polite suggestion. "You seek to flow like water," the Void Walker's hollow voice echoed. "But you are still trapped in a body of bone and meat. Why? If you want to be the sea, stop being the man." Giyu paused, his eyes narrowing. He closed his eyes, his total concentration breathing shifting into something deeper, something the wizards called universal respiration. His skin began to take on a translucent, crystalline sheen. When he swung his sword again, his entire arm dissolved into a whip of freezing brine, striking the Voidwalker's shadow and actually drawing a spark of starlight. While the apprentices were breaking their limits, a far darker union was being forged in the bowels of a mountain fortress 300 miles away. All for One sat in a throne of twisted iron, his faceless head bowed. The temporal loop the Chronomancer had placed him in had finally stabilized, but at a terrible cost. His body was a patchwork of eras. One hand was that of an infant, the other a withered centenarian claw. Beside him, Muzan Kibutsuji paced like a caged tiger. The Demon King's face was a map of jagged porcelain scars that refused to heal, a permanent reminder of the Grand Alchemist's artistry. "They are not heroes," Muzan spat, his voice a venomous rasp. "They are monsters. They treat our world like a petri dish. My children, my upper moons, they are being turned into garden decorations and singing flowers. They are an anomaly," All for One countered, his voice rattling in his chest. "But even a god can be bled if you find the right vein. I have spent a century collecting quirks that manipulate the soul and the fabric of space. I have found that their magic is not infinite. It requires a medium. They are drawing from the life force of this planet." Muzan stopped pacing, his red eyes glowing with a predatory light. "And what do you propose, symbol of evil? My demons are being slaughtered by children wielding the sun. We give them a target they cannot ignore," All for One said, a slow, horrific grin spreading across his ruined face. "You have the blood. I have the infrastructure. We will create a new breed of life, a quirk-demon hybrid that doesn't just regenerate but adapts to arcane interference. And I have found something, a catalyst." All for One gestured to a stone table in the center of the room. Resting upon it was a small, unassuming blue flower. Muzan gasped, lunging forward. "The blue spider lily! Where? How?" "One of my scouts found a patch of them growing near the crater where the wizards arrived," All for One explained. "It seems their arrival bled enough exotic energy into the soil to force the lilies into bloom. With this, your demons will no longer fear the sun. And with my quirks, they will be able to eat the very magic those wizards use." The two villains looked at each other, a fascist god and a cowardly demon, and for the first time in history, their goals were perfectly aligned. They didn't want to rule the world anymore. They wanted to murder the sky. Back at the Institute, the atmosphere was growing increasingly claustrophobic. The sky above Mustafu was no longer violet. It was turning the color of a bruised lung, and the stars were visibly vibrating. The Void Eaters were closing in, their presence causing ripples of existential dread to wash over the city. Frenrir stood on the roof of the main building, his hat fluttering in a wind that didn't exist. He was holding a bowl of salad, idly picking out a blue spider lily and popping it into his mouth. "Tastes like blueberries and ancient sorrow," he remarked to the Grand Alchemist, who was busy calibrating a massive brass telescope. "You know, the locals are going to be very upset when they find out I've been eating their legendary immortality flower as a snack." "The locals have bigger problems, Frenrir," the alchemist replied, not looking away from the lens. "The Void Eaters have reached the Oort cloud. They've already deleted 3 of this system's outer moons. In approximately 6 hours, they will begin the unmaking of the Earth's atmosphere." "Well," Frenrir sighed, wiping his mouth on his sleeve, "I suppose we should see if our little projects are ready for their final exam. Chrono, bring the kids up here. And tell the ones with the swords to stop trying to breathe. The air is about to become non-conceptual anyway." As the students and Hashira gathered on the roof, looking up at the terrifying, oily darkness swallowing the stars, Midoriya stepped forward. His emerald lightning was now laced with threads of white-hot arcane fire. "Master Frenrir," Midoriya said, his voice steady. "We can feel it. The world, it feels like it's being forgotten." "That's because it is, Greenbean," Frenrir said, turning to face them. His eyes were no longer manic. They were deep, ancient wells of power. "The Void Eaters are the ultimate critics. They think your universe is a bad draft, and they're here to hit the delete key. But here's the thing about magic. It's the ultimate ink. As long as you're loud enough, the universe has to remember you." Suddenly, the ground beneath the Institute shook. A massive explosion of black ichor and red lightning erupted from the city below. A horde of nightmares began to swarm toward the school, creatures that were half Nomu, half demon, their bodies bristling with eyes and serrated bone, their very presence draining the color from the world. Leading them was a figure in a pristine suit, and a man with a faceless mask. "Oh, look!" Frenrir grinned. his staff beginning to hum with a sound that cracked the pavement. The management brought a protest march. This is perfect. A two-front war. I love a good challenge before the end of the world. He looked at Midoriya, Bakugo, and the Hashira. All right, children. Lesson 3. If you're going to die, make sure you do it in a way that's impossible to explain. Charge! The descent from the roof of the Frenrir Institute was not a fall, it was an atmospheric re-entry. As Frenrir barked his command, the obsidian platform beneath the students and Hashira didn't just tilt. It dissolved into a slipstream of frictionless light. They weren't just charging a villain army, they were being fired like a railgun shell into the heart of the nightmare-swarming Mustafu. Midoriya was the first to hit the ground. He didn't land with a smash, he landed with a revelation. As his feet touched the cracked asphalt, a shockwave of emerald and white light erupted, instantly rewriting the molecular structure of the street. The asphalt didn't just shatter, it turned into thousands of jagged, sentient glass shards that immediately rose into the air, orbiting Midoriya like a defensive cloud of daggers. Beside him, the ghosts of the one-for-all predecessors, Nana Shimura and the others, radiated a heat so intense that the nearby buildings began to glow cherry red. "I see them, Banjo!" Midoriya shouted, his eyes flashing with a terrifying dual-toned light. "The strings of their souls, they're knotted and rotting." "Then cut the knots, kid," the spirit of the fifth user roared, his black whip tendrils now shimmering with the iridescent oil of the void. Before them stood the first wave of the villain-demon alliance. These were not the Nomu of old. All for One and Muzan had created something far more perverse. These creatures had the multi-limbed, grotesque musculature of high-end Nomu, but their skin was etched with the pulsating crimson veins of upper moon blood. Because of the blue spider lily infusion, they stood in the unnatural violet light of the fading sun, without a hint of discomfort. Their eyes, dozens of them peppering their torsos, glowed with the combined malice of quirk evolution and blood demon arts. One particularly massive hybrid, a four-armed titan with the head of a wolf and the wings of a bat, lunged at Bakugo. It unleashed a sonic shriek quirk amplified by a vibrational blood art, a sound wave capable of liquefying internal organs instantly. Bakugo didn't even blink. His hair, now glowing like magnesium, stood on end as he raised his palms. "You think you're loud? I'm the one who invented the Big Bang, you flea-bitten reject." Bakugo didn't just create an explosion. He reached into the concept of combustion that Frenrir had whispered to him during training. His howitzer impact didn't just produce fire and noise, it produced a localized rupture in space-time. A miniature star ignited between his hands for a fraction of a second, and the resulting blast didn't just push the hybrid back, it deleted the creature's upper torso from the physical world, leaving only a pair of smoking legs and a lingering scent of ozone and scorched roses. "Don't get cocky, explosion boy," Sanemi Shinazugawa yelled, his wind-breathing now manifesting as literal, razor-sharp vacuum blades that extended 20 feet from his sword. He moved through the horde like a hurricane made of knives, each swing decapitating 3 hybrids at once. The wind wasn't just air anymore. It was the world's own rejection of these unnatural beings. However, the tide began to shift. All for One, watching from a distance atop a spire of twisted, porcelain-covered rubble, raised his mismatched hands. "Eat, my children," he whispered. "Consume the information they offer. Turn their magic into our strength." As the students and Hashira unleashed their new, spectacular powers, the hybrids didn't just die. Those that survived the initial strikes began to change. Their skin turned a dull, matte black, the color of a magic sink. One hybrid caught Midoriya's emerald white lightning in its bare hand, and, instead of disintegrating, it began to grow. Its muscles swelled with arcane energy, and it spat the lightning back at him in a corrupted, jagged bolt of obsidian fire. "Master Frenrir!" Midoriya cried out, barely dodging the reflected blast. "They're adapting. They're eating the spells." Frenrir, who was currently floating mid-air while reclining on a sofa made of solidified screams, yawned. He was idly spinning his staff, watching the oily darkness of the Void Eaters coil closer to the moon. "Of course they are, Green Bean. That's what parasites do. You're giving them a 5-course meal of high-level reality warping. If I were a bioengineered nightmare, I'd be asking for seconds too." "Then what do we do?" Gyu Tomioka shouted, his water-breathing, dead calm now creating a literal lake of stasis around him, though the hybrids were starting to swim through it by vibrating their molecules at high frequencies. Lesson 4! Frenrir shouted, his voice booming over the roar of the battle. If they're eating your magic, give them a meal they can't digest. Stop using power. Start using paradox. Give them things that shouldn't exist even in a world of wizards. The Chronomancer stepped forward, hovering just behind the front lines. He looked at the looming Void Eaters in the sky and then down at the Villain Demon Alliance. The Void Eaters are beginning their defragmentation, he noted coolly. If we don't resolve this local infestation in the next 10 minutes, there won't be an Earth left to save. Alchemist? Frenrir called out. Do you have the catalyst ready? The Grand Alchemist appeared in a burst of silver steam, holding a heavy, lead-lined cylinder. Ready, Frenrir, but it requires a soul with a very high connectivity rating, someone who is already a bridge between worlds. Every eye, both wizard and hero, turned to Izuku Midoriya. Oh, come on, Midoriya groaned, even as his body began to hum with a resonance that shook the buildings. Is it always me? You have the one-for-all legacy, kid, Frenrir said, dropping from his sofa to land lightly on his feet. The playful madness in his eyes had been replaced by a sharp, clinical intensity. You are already a collection of memories held together by sheer will. You're the perfect universal ink. If we pump enough alchemical residue through your quirk, you can write these monsters out of the script. But it's going to hurt. A lot. Before Midoriya could answer, the air was torn apart by a sound like a world-ending bell. The first of the Void Eaters had touched the atmosphere. The sky didn't just go dark, it began to turn into static. Parts of the city, buildings, trees, and people began to flicker and vanish into gray, pixelated dust. Muzan Kibutsuji, seeing the sky dissolve, let out a shriek of primal terror. The world is dying. All for one, you promised me immortality. You promised me a world where I could rule. The world is being deleted, you fool. All for one roared, his own body starting to flicker as the Void Eater's influence reached them. We must take the wizard's power now. It's the only thing that exists outside the script. The Villain Demon Alliance made their final desperate push. Thousands of hybrids, sensing the end, surged toward the Frenrir Institute in a tidal wave of meat and malice. Muzan himself transformed into a towering mass of porcelain-armored flesh and mouths, and All for One unleashed every quirk he had ever stolen in a single chaotic beam of annihilation. Frenrir grinned, his staff beginning to glow with a light that made the sun look like a candle. Hold on to your concepts! It's about to get very loud! He slammed his staff into Midoriya's chest, not to kill him, but to act as a conductor. Midoriya's scream was lost in a pillar of white-hot arcane fire that shot into the static-filled sky, a defiant beacon in a world that was being forgotten. The pillar of light erupting from Midoriya's chest was not mere energy. It was meaning. In a world that the Void Eaters were rapidly turning into static, Midoriya had become the only thing that was definitively real. The arcane residue, pumped into him by the Grand Alchemist, acted as a cosmic solvent, dissolving the boundaries between his physical self and the 8 souls of the one-for-all vestiges. He was no longer a boy, he was a living grimoire, his skin covered in glowing, shifting text that described the history of every hero who had ever lived. It's too much. Midoriya's voice was a chorus of 9 voices, ranging from the gravelly roar of Banjo to the soft, determined whisper of Nana Shimura. The world, I can feel it being erased. It's like 1,000 voices are being muted at once. Don't listen to the silence, Greenbean. Frenrir roared, his hat flying off his head to reveal a scalp etched with pulsing ley lines. He was holding his staff with both hands, the crystal at the top vibrating so violently it was beginning to liquefy. The Void Eaters are just cosmic editors. They only delete what they don't find interesting. Be the most interesting thing in the multiverse. Be a paradox. As the Villain Demon Alliance surged forward, led by the gargantuan, porcelain-mouthed horror that was Muzan Kibutsuji, the paradox warfare began. Bakugo was the first to grasp the concept. He realized that the hybrids were eating his explosions, because they understood the science of combustion. So he stopped making sense. He reached into his palms, and instead of igniting nitroglycerin like sweat, he ignited his confusion. When he slammed his hands together, the resulting blast didn't produce fire. It produced cold heat, a sapphire-colored eruption that froze the hybrids solid while simultaneously turning their internal organs into boiling steam. It was a physical impossibility, a thermal contradiction that the magic-sinking hybrids couldn't process. They didn't just die, they glitched out of existence, their matte black skin flickering before they dissolved into nonsensical strings of binary code. "How's that for an explosion, you extras?" Bakugo screamed, his eyes glowing with a manic white light. "I'm blowing up the very idea of you." Beside him, Giyu Tomioka and Sanemi Shinazugawa were performing their own impossible feats. Giyu's water-breathing, 11th form, dead calm, had evolved into absolute stasis. He wasn't just stopping the movement of his enemies, he was stopping the movement of time within a 10-foot radius. The hybrids that entered his circle didn't just stop, they became statues of frozen history, their past and future compressed into a single, unmoving second. Sanemi, meanwhile, was using vacuum breathing to slice through the static of the Void Eaters itself. Every swing of his blade carved a path of reality through the pixelated gray dust, creating safe zones for the retreating civilians and lower-ranked heroes. But the real threat remained the two kings of the underworld. All for One and Muzan had reached the epicenter of the arcane storm. They were no longer entirely human or demon. They had become data leeches. All for One's faceless head was surrounded by a halo of stolen quirks that had been forced to evolve into pseudo-magic by the presence of the blue spider lily. He reached out with a hand that was a mass of writhing black and gold tendrils, aiming directly for the text-covered skin of Midoriya. "If you are the script, then I shall be the author." All for One's voice was a distorted screech. "I will steal the very concept of your existence." I think this is a really nice way to just talk naturally together, talk plainly. I think this is a really nice way to just talk naturally together, talk plainly. Lunged from the other side, his porcelain-armored limbs transforming into hundreds of whip-like spines that glowed with a sickly purple arcane poison. "I will not be deleted," the Demon King shrieked. "I will eat the sun. I will eat the sky. I will eat you, wizard." Frenrir stepped between them and Midoriya, his expression suddenly chillingly calm. "You know," the madman whispered, and the sound carried over the roar of the collapsing universe. "I've seen a lot of villains in my time. I've seen gods of destruction, lords of the abyss, and emperors of 1,000 suns. But you two, you're just sad. You're so afraid of the end that you'd rather be monsters in a dying world than memories in a living one." He didn't use his staff. He didn't use a spell. He simply reached out and caught Muzan's central spine in one hand and All for One's primary tendril in the other. "Grand Alchemist! Chrono! Now!" The Chronomancer appeared above them, his hands spinning in a blur. "Temporal inversion. Activated." The Grand Alchemist threw a dozen vials into the air, which shattered into a cloud of existential catalyst. Suddenly, the script on Midoriya's skin began to bleed outward, flowing into Frenrir and then through him into the two villains. But it wasn't the power they wanted, it was context. Muzan Kibutsuji was suddenly flooded with the memories of every human he had ever murdered. He didn't just see them, he felt them. He felt the cold steel of the Nichiren blades, the grief of the families left behind, and the weight of 1,000 years of cowardice. The porcelain on his skin began to crack, but not from an external strike. It was cracking from the inside, forced apart by the sheer volume of humanity being shoved into his demonic soul. He began to shrivel, his gargantuan form collapsing into the small, sickly man he had been a millennium ago, his screams turning into the pathetic whimpers of a dying child. All for One fared no better. The universal ink from Midoriya didn't just give him the one-for-all quirks, it gave him the will of the users. For the first time in his long life, the symbol of evil wasn't the master of the voices in his head. The thousands of quirks he had stolen over the decades suddenly developed self-awareness. They didn't want to serve him anymore. They wanted to go home. All for One's body began to physically unravel, his flesh turning into a swarm of glowing butterflies, each one representing a stolen life, flying away into the static-filled sky. "The management has been liquidated," Frenrir noted, letting go of the two hollow husks of the world's greatest villains. But the victory was short-lived. The Void Eaters had finally descended. The massive, oily darkness slammed into the planet's surface, and the world of MHA and Demon Slayer vanished. There was no more ground, no more sky, no more Mustafu. There was only a vast gray void of unformed data, and in the center of it, a small island of reality, held together by the wizards, the Hashira, and the students of Class 1A. Midoriya, still glowing with the light of the universal ink, looked around at the nothingness. Is it over? Did we lose? Lose? Frenrir laughed, though it sounded tired. He sat down on the gray, pixelated floor, his staff dimming. Kid, we're just getting to the good part. The world has been unmade. That means the canvas is finally clean. He looked at the Grand Alchemist and the Chronomancer, who were already starting to draw runes in the gray dust. We have exactly 3 minutes before the Void Eaters realize we're still here and come back to finish the job, Frenrir said, his eyes turning to the Hashira and the heroes. So, who wants to help me write a new world? One with a little more color and maybe a few less man-eating demons. The Void Eater's roar echoed through the nothingness, a sound like a billion hard drives crashing at once. The final battle for existence hadn't ended. It had just moved to a place where there were no more rules. The gray void was not a place. It was the absence of a place. It was a silent, pixelated limbo, where the memory of Mustafu's skyscrapers and the Taisho era's cherry blossoms had been reduced to cold, unmoving data. Standing on their shrinking island of reality, the survivors looked like ghosts, in a world that had forgotten how to haunt. Frenrir, the madman, was the only one who didn't look terrified. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the void, sketching symbols into the gray dust with a finger that left trails of neon blue fire. Don't just stand there looking existential. Frenrir barked, his voice echoing in a way that suggested the echo was just the void trying to figure out how to process sound. The Void Eaters are like hungry librarians. They've finished eating the books, and now they're coming back to shred the shelves. If we don't start writing right now, the silence is going to become permanent. The Chronomancer stood at the edge of their island, his eyes ticking like synchronized clocks. Master Frenrir, the defragmentation sentinels have arrived. They are sensing the high-density information contained within the One-for-All vessel and the Hashira souls. They view us as corrupted files. Out of the gray nothingness, the sentinels emerged. They were not creatures of flesh, or even of magic. They were floating, geometric nightmares, shifting polyhedrons of obsidian glass that vibrated with a low-frequency hum that made the survivors' teeth ache. As they approached, the edges of the reality island began to flake away into gray ash. Bakugo! Todoroki! Hashira! Hold the line! Midoriya shouted, his voice vibrating with the power of the 9 souls. His skin was still covered in the universal ink, the shifting text of history glowing with a fierce, defiant light. If those things touch the island, we lose everything. Bakugo didn't need to be told twice. He lunged forward, his palms erupting not with fire, but with negative space. He had mastered the lesson of the paradox. When he blasted the nearest sentinel, the explosion didn't push outward. It pulled inward, creating a localized vacuum of meaning that sucked the geometric horror into its own center, until it collapsed into a harmless marble of glass. Come and get it, you overgrown geometry homework, Bakugo roared, his pigtails, still present from his earlier transformation, whipping in the cosmic wind. He was a whirlwind of impossible physics, blowing up the very concepts of shape and volume. Beside him, the Flame Hashira's legacy was being upheld by those who remained. Kyojuro Rengoku's spirit, pulled into a semi-tangible state by the presence of the wizards, stood back-to-back with Shoto Todoroki. The two of them unleashed a combined strike of conceptual heat. Todoroki's fire wasn't just high-temperature plasma, it was the warmth of home. It burned with a golden light that the sentinels couldn't process. Where the fire touched the gray void, the gray turned back into solid, warm earth. Set your soul ablaze, young Todoroki, the spirit of Rengoku boomed, his voice a pillar of strength in the nothingness. We are not just fighting for our lives. We are fighting for the right of the sun to rise again. As the combatants held back the sentinels, Frenrir looked up at Midoriya. All right, Green Bean, here's the deal. A world is just a story that enough people believe in. I have the grammar and the syntax. That's the magic. But I don't have the story. I'm a wizard. My stories are all about blowing things up and finding better hats. I need your stories. I need the memory of every hero who fell, every demon who sought redemption, and every child who ever dreamed of being more than they were. The Grand Alchemist stepped forward, holding a massive, empty crystal vessel. We're going to use the one-for-all connection as a siphon. We will pull the essence of the old world through you, filter it through our arcane matrices, and spray it back out onto the void like cosmic graffiti. It's going to hurt, isn't it? Midoriya asked, his hands trembling. Like being born and dying at the same time, the alchemist confirmed with a clinical nod. But on the bright side, you'll be the first person in history to literally become a planet. Midoriya took a deep breath. He looked at his friends, Uraraka, who was using her zero gravity to keep the sentinels from anchoring themselves, Ida, whose engine was now propelling him through the void at the speed of a thought, and the Hashira, who were moving in a beautiful, deadly dance of elemental fury. Do it, Midoriya said. Frenrir slammed his staff into the ground at Midoriya's feet. Chrono, anchor the timeline. Alchemist, start the distillation. Voidwalker, try to look busy. The process was agonizing. Midoriya let out a scream that wasn't a sound, but a visual eruption of memories. From his body, streams of information began to pour. They saw the founding of UA High. They saw the first time a human developed a quirk. They saw the ancient battle between the first Demon Slayer and Muzan Kibutsuji. They saw the small, quiet moments, too. A mother tucking in her child, a slayer sharpening a sword by moonlight, the taste of a bowl of ramen after a long day of training. The wizards caught these streams, their hands glowing as they wove the memories together. Frenrir was the conductor, his staff waving through the air as if he were painting on a canvas of infinity. Too much gray, Frenrir shouted. Add more blue. I want the sky to be so blue it makes people want to cry. And give me mountains, big ones, with snow that tastes like peppermint. The Void Eaters didn't like being rewritten. The geometric sentinels began to merge, forming a singular, colossal entity, a deletion god that loomed over their island. It was a massive, shifting cube of pure non-existence, and it brought with it a command that vibrated through the survivors' souls. "Oh, shut up!" Frenrir screamed at the sky, his eyes burning with a terrifying ancient light. "We're busy!" He flicked a finger, and a bolt of sarcastic lightning struck the deletion god. The bolt didn't damage the cube, it turned the cube into a giant wooden cuckoo clock. The hum of non-existence was replaced by a cheerful, "Cuckoo! Cuckoo! The world is coming back!" Uraraka cried out, pointing at the horizon. Through the gray void, colors were beginning to bleed. It wasn't the old world exactly. It was something new. A merged reality, where the technology of the Hero Society and the ancient, spiritual aesthetics of the Demon Slayer era were blending into a single, cohesive tapestry. The Institute was no longer just a school. It was becoming a sprawling, floating citadel that anchored the new continent. But the strain was reaching its peak. Midoriya's body was beginning to flicker, the universal ink on his skin glowing so brightly, it was starting to burn through his physical form. "He can't hold it, Frenrir," the Chronomancer warned. "The information density is too high. He's going to evaporate before the world is finished." Frenrir looked at the boy, then at the half-finished world, and finally at his own staff. He sighed, a sound of genuine, rare regret. "Fine. I suppose I'll have to use the emergency fund," Frenrir muttered. He looked at the survivors. "Listen up. If you want to keep your world, you have to give it a name. Every story needs a title. Shout it out. What is this place?" "The World of Heroes," Bakugo roared. "The Path of the Sun," the Hashira shouted in unison. "One for all." Midoriya gasped through his pain. Frenrir grinned, his staff shattering into a million glowing shards that flew into Midoriya. "Close enough. Let's call it the Madman's Masterpiece, or maybe just Tuesday." With a final, reality-breaking surge of power, the gray void was swept away by a tidal wave of color, sound, and life. The Void Eaters were pushed back into the deep dark, their delete command overridden by a much more powerful create. The tidal wave of color didn't just settle, it congealed. The merged reality was a breathtaking, impossible landscape where the futuristic skyscrapers of Mustafu were now carved from ancient, demon-repelling wisteria wood, and the neon lights were powered by captured lightning and bottled sunlight. But the right command was incomplete. The sky above this new world was a flickering mosaic of what used to be and what was meant to be, a jagged ceiling of unfinished history. At the center of the floating citadel, the heart of the new UA Izuku Midoriya was beginning to come apart. The universal ink was no longer just on his skin, it was his skin. He had become a living monument of text, his every heartbeat a rhythmic thrum that echoed the stories of billions. But the human vessel was never meant to hold the weight of a planet's reboot. Cracks of blinding white light were spiderwebbing across his chest, and where his tears fell, they didn't hit the ground. They turned into small, unwritten poems that floated away into the air. "He's redlining!" Frenrir screamed, his own form flickering as he poured the last of his staff's essence into the boy. "Alchemist, the ink is too thick. It's not drying. If it doesn't set, the whole world is going to smudge into a mess of gray sludge." The Grand Alchemist looked at the horizon, where the massive cuckoo clock, the transformed deletion god, was beginning to revert. The cuckoo sound was being replaced by a deep, guttural grinding of cosmic gears. The void wasn't done. It was attempting a system restore, a swarm of eraser wraiths, formless white silhouettes that left trails of nothingness, erupted from the clock's face, screaming with the sound of 1,000 deleted files. "We need a seal!" the alchemist shouted back, his goggles cracking under the pressure of the raw arcane output. "We need something to weigh down the story, something permanent." Frenrir looked at the Hashira and the heroes. They were exhausted, their new powers flickering, their bodies broken from the battle in the void. He looked at Bakugo, who was currently holding back 3 eraser wraiths with explosions of solidified pride, and at Guillaume, who was using his marshmallow flail, now turned into a devastating sphere of gravitational sorrow, to crush the geometric invaders. "The seal can't be a person," Frenrir whispered, his manic energy suddenly cooling into a terrifying crystalline focus. "And it can't be a spell. It has to be a price. A grimdark truth that binds the dream to the reality." He turned to the Chronomancer. "Chrono, give me the eternal second." "I'm going to do something very stupid." The Chronomancer's eyes stopped ticking. "Master Frenrir, if you do that, you won't be a visitor anymore. You'll be a law. You'll never be able to leave this world. You'll be the gravity that keeps the stars from falling, but you'll be trapped in the foundation." "I've always wanted to be a landlord," Frenrir grinned, but there was no humor in it. He stepped toward Midoriya, his hands glowing with a dark, heavy violet light, the color of a bruise on the soul. "Listen to me, Greenbean, and all of you heroes and slayers. Your world was dying because it was too fragile. It was a world of good and evil, of sun and shadow. It was too easy to break. If you want to survive the void, you have to be heavy. You have to accept the necessary atrocity." Frenrir reached into the light of Midoriya's chest. He didn't pull out the power. He pushed his own madness into it. He was injecting the grimdark philosophy of his home universe into the hopeful, shonen logic of MHA and Demon Slayer. "I am the seal," Frenrir roared. "From this day forth, your quirks are no longer just gifts. They are soul scars. Every time you use your power, you will feel the weight of the billions who died to create this world. Your breathing is no longer just air. It is the scent of the fallen. You will be powerful, but you will never be innocent again." The sky suddenly turned a deep, blood red, then snapped into a perfect, terrifying blue. The universal ink on Midoriya's skin stopped flickering and began to sink into his bones, turning into permanent black tattoos that told the history of the Great Unmaking. The eraser wraiths let out a final, agonizing shriek as they were suddenly granted weight. They were no longer deletions. They were turned into gargoyles of regret, petrified instantly and becoming part of the Institute's architecture. The deletion god, the great cuckoo clock, shattered into a billion pieces of common dust, falling over the new world like a soft gray snow that fertilized the soil. The world clicked. The sensation was felt by every living thing in the new reality. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock that would never be opened again. The merged world was finished. It was a place of high magic, of industrial heroism, and of spiritual duty. But the air felt different. It felt thick. It felt like a place where choices had consequences that lasted for centuries, not just episodes. Midoriya collapsed to his knees, the white light fading. He was alive, but his eyes were different. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the source code and realized that the author was a madman. He looked at his hands covered in the ink tattoos. He could feel the power, more power than any one-for-all user had ever dreamed of, but he could also feel the price. Every time he moved, He felt the ghosts of the old world pulling at his heels, reminding him that his existence was a debt that could never be repaid. Frenrir was no longer standing on the roof. In his place was a massive, obsidian statue of a man in a pointed hat, holding a staff that pierced the very center of the citadel. The statue's eyes glowed with a faint, eternal violet light. He was the anchor. He was the necessary evil that kept the world from drifting back into the void. The Grand Alchemist and the Chronomancer stood beside the statue, their own forms looking faded, like old photographs. "He did it," the alchemist whispered, looking out over the new Mustafu, where the people were beginning to wake up in a world they didn't recognize, but felt they had always known. He turned a what-if into a forever. "But at what cost?" the Chronomancer asked, looking at the sky, where the stars were now fixed and unmoving. "The world is safe, but it is no longer bright. It is grim. It is a world where there is only war against the darkness, and the darkness is now part of the light." The Voidwalker, the only one who remained fully tangible, looked at Midoriya and the Hashira. "The training is over," the Shadow whispered. "Now, the actual war begins. The Void Eaters are gone, but the Shadow's Frenrir left behind. They are hungry, and they are yours to manage." The students of Class 1A and the Hashira stood together on the balcony of the floating citadel. They looked down at their new world, a world of magic, steel, and heroism, but also a world of sacrifice and ancient, heavy truths. They weren't just heroes or slayers anymore. They were the wardens of the madman's masterpiece. The first dawn of the merged world did not break with a simple sunrise. It arrived with a symphony of gears and the scent of incense-infused ozone. As the light hit the horizon, it revealed a landscape that would have been unrecognizable to any historian of the old eras. The floating citadel of the Frenrir Institute sat at the center of a continent where high-tech maglev trains sped past shrines carved from solid gravity, and where the heroes on patrol wore capes embroidered with warding runes and carried Nichiren alloy sidearms. The static was gone, but in its place was a world that felt ancient and heavy, as if the very mountains were aware of the cost of their creation. In the center of the Institute's Grand Plaza, Izuku Midoriya stood before the obsidian statue of Frenrir. The universal ink was no longer a glowing fire. It had settled into a series of matte black, intricate tattoos that wrapped around his arms and climbed his neck, ending just below his jawline. To the public, they were marks of divinity. To Midoriya, they were the ledger of a debt. Every time he used One for All, now infused with the grimdark weight of Frenrir's magic, he didn't just feel a surge of power. He felt the collective memory of the world that had been unmade. "He's still watching, isn't he?" Midoriya turned to see Bakugo standing behind him. The explosive hero was no longer in a tutu. Frenrir's parting joke had faded, but his hero costume was different now. It was reinforced with porcelain weave armor, and featured a high collar etched with anti-corruption sigils. His eyes, once purely aggressive, held a sharp, cold focus. He had spent the last 3 days helping the Hashira hunt down the static glitches, remnants of the villain-demon alliance that hadn't been fully deleted, but had instead become mindless, pixelated husks of meat and malice. "He's more than watching, Kachan," Midoriya said, looking up at the glowing violet eyes of the statue. "He's the floor beneath our feet. He's the reason the air doesn't turn back into gray dust. The Chronomancer told me that as long as the anchor stands, the Void Eaters can't find us. We're hidden in the madman's shadow." The remaining wizards, the Grand Alchemist and the Chronomancer, were preparing to depart. Their work was finished. They stood near the edge of the citadel, their forms looking translucent against the new, vibrant sky. The Voidwalker had already vanished, becoming a spectral warden that haunted the borders of reality, ensuring no more visitors entered without a price being paid. "It's a stable system," the Grand Alchemist noted, adjusting his cracked goggles. "The quirk-breathing hybrid biology is self-sustaining. The demons are no longer progenitor-based. They are internal shadows, manifestations of a person's own corruption that must be fought through spiritual discipline. You've traded a physical monster for a psychological one. It's much more efficient for long-term survival." "And the villains?" Midoriya asked. The Chronomancer pointed toward the city below. "Muzan Kibutsuji is living out his remaining 3 weeks of life as a frail, human old man in a hospice for the forgotten. He has no blood, no power, and no memory of his perfection. only the fear of the dark. As for All for One, he is the butterflies. Every time someone in this world feels a moment of genuine selflessness, one of those butterflies dies. He is being unmade by the very thing he spent a century trying to kill. The alchemist turned to Midoriya, his expression uncharacteristically solemn. Remember, Vessel, this world is a masterpiece, but it is also a trap. You have the power to protect it, but you are now part of the machinery. The script you carry in your bones is the only copy left. If you fail, if you let your soul be corrupted by the darkness Frenrir injected into this world, the anchor will break, and the void will not be as patient next time. I understand, Midoriya said, his hand tightening into a fist. The black tattoos on his skin hummed with a low, rhythmic power. The price is survival. I'll pay it every day. The two wizards nodded, and with a sound like a page being turned, they vanished. They didn't leave through a rift. They simply ceased to be part of the local narrative. The Hashira approached then, led by Gyomei and Giyu. They were no longer demon slayers in the traditional sense. They had become the sons and daughters of the Anchor. Their breathing styles had become arcane disciplines, capable of cutting through not just flesh, but through the conceptual rot that now threatened the world. The order is ready, Midoriya, Giyu said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. The Hero Public Safety Commission has been restructured into the Inquisition of the Arcane. We have identified the first of the soul-marked children. Their powers are dangerous, unrefined. Without the old laws of biology, their quirks are becoming manifestations of their inner state. Then we train them, Midoriya said, turning back to the school. We don't teach them how to be symbols of peace. Peace is a luxury we can't afford. We teach them how to be wardens of the dark. We teach them that the price of their power is the burden they carry for those who have none. As the sun reached its zenith, casting a long, violet shadow from Frenrir's statue across the city, the students of the newly named Frenrir Institute gathered in the plaza. They were the first generation of a new species, beings of magic, technology, and steel. They looked up at Midoriya, their new headmaster, and the living script, and they saw the black ink on his skin. They saw the truth that Frenrir had forced upon them. The world was beautiful, but it was a beauty bought with a horrific coin. The monsters were gone, but the struggle for existence had only just begun. The sky was blue, but it was a blue that hid the prowling hunger of the Void Eaters. Midoriya stepped to the edge of the balcony, his voice amplified by the universal ink, to reach every corner of the merged continent. Class is in session, he declared, and for a moment, the violet eyes of the statue seemed to flash with a manic, satisfied light. The first lesson of the new world is simple. Reality is a gift you have to fight for every single second. And in this world, there is no more plus ultra. There is only the anchor, and the war that keeps it from breaking. The world responded with a roar of approval that shook the very foundations of the Citadel. It was a sound of grim determination, of a humanity that had looked into the void and chosen to become something harder, something stranger, something that could survive the madman's chaos. The wizards had left their mark. The what-if had become the only way. And as the first day of the new era came to a close, the merged world prepared for its eternal vigil against the silence. Conclusion. The collision between the arcane chaos of Mad Man Frenrir's wizards and the structured realities of My Hero Academia and Demon Slayer resulted in something far more profound than a mere victory. It was a fundamental restructuring of existence. By injecting the grimdark philosophy of a universe that knows no mercy into the hopeful arcs of heroes and slayers, Frenrir did not just save the world from the Void Eaters, he hardened it. The new status quo is a merged reality, where the biological and the spiritual have fused, creating a society that is as powerful as it is haunted. Izuku Midoriya remains the central pillar of this new world, a living grimoire who carries the weight of billions in his very marrow. The villains Muzan and All for One have been rendered into footnotes of history, their malice repurposed into the very shadows that the new generation must master. The wizards have moved on to other dimensions, but the anchor of Frenrir stands as a permanent reminder that survival has a price, and that peace is merely the time between wars. The war for humanity's existence in this nightmare masterpiece is only just beginning.